Okay, good evening, everybody. Apologies for the late start. Welcome to this evening's workshop on engendering a culture of prevention on campuses. We'll be talking about the bystander approach, not the bystander intervention model, but I'll leave Jackson to say a little bit more about that later. In Hong Kong, as in other parts of the world, statistics reveal that 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. Findings from a 2013 study conducted by the Department of Special Education and Counseling at the Hong Kong Institute of Education, commissioned by the EOC, reveal that over 50% of the 5,000 plus survey respondents had experienced some form of sexual harassment in the preceding year. Women were more likely to correctly identify conduct as sexual harassment when compared with men. University students were better able to characterize conduct as sexual harassment when compared with primary and secondary school students. 97% of victims who had experienced sexual harassment said the harassers were their boy or girlfriends. The remainder were classmates or friends. 49% said that sexual harassment primarily occurred at school or on campus, with 25% of it happening in the classrooms. And the remainder occurred in the surrounding vicinity of the school premises or on transport en route to school. 58% of sexually harassed students kept silent. 51% complained to the harassers. 39% tell classmates or their friends, whereas 34% call the police. They seldom seek assistance from family members or seniors in school or the EOC. And this is despite the fact that over 50% had said that schools distributed flyers, leaflets, and information on sexual harassment, and that the school had clear guidelines on dealing with such incidents. And nearly 50% said that there were workshops or assemblies held on the subject. Respondents said that education material was too focused on the definitions of harassment, but lacked examples of real-life application of the principles. This made it difficult for them to gauge whether they were entitled to call what happened to them sexual harassment or abuse or violence. And as a result, they didn't know if they were entitled to use the support systems that were in place for such conduct on campus in schools. Others were of the view that those who manned the support mechanisms in schools were ill-prepared to advise them properly in the situations that they encountered. These figures, depressing as they are, highlight a critical reality that unfortunately not many educators, parents, and students are aware of. If we were sufficiently tuned into this reality, we would be doing much, much more to prevent the incidents, but also to support those around us who have experienced sexual harassment and think more deeply about the perpetrators of abuse, to understand how and why they do it, and how do we get them to stop. When we discuss sexual harassment as a community, the attitude tends to be one of distancing. We act as though this isn't prevalent here. It happens, but it's not common. Or if it's happening, it's not happening here. It happens in patriarchal, backward communities or societies that are male-dominated. We feel that these places are far removed from us, or we blame the victims. He or she shouldn't be going to such places in the first place at an hour when they should have been tucked in their bed. Why were they drinking? We say victims got themselves into these situations, so they're responsible for their own choices, and these are the consequences if they choose to dress a particular way or mingle with particular crowds. Moreover, as the studies clearly show, the attitude is that this is what happens in school, at university, when you're a teenager, or when you're a freshman. People normalize such conduct, particularly the peer group, and it's expected to be taken as playful or a joke. You aren't meant to complain. You aren't supposed to take it seriously. What these figures show, however, is that the reality is far closer than we would have ourselves believe or acknowledge. Sexual harassment does happen here, around us, on our campus, all the time. We are that patriarchal society in which such behavior continues to manifest itself, in which we do blame victims, in which victims do prefer silence to reaching out, in which victims are violated in places where they're entitled to be, entitled to expect trust in spaces of learning and friendship, and by the very people that they trust the most, the people they see and know every day. And this doesn't just apply to our peers, but also to our seniors, our mentors, our teachers. They also experience harassment at the hands of those who are supposed to protect us. More worryingly, despite campaigns to raise awareness and educate people, this does continue to happen at an alarming rate. We at Hong Kong U would like to do something to change this attitude and address these issues. And if we don't, the silence, our silence, just like the piercing silence of countless others who call people out when they complain about sexual abuse and violence, makes us complicit in these very acts. The Center for Comparative and Public Law and the Women's Studies Research Center are most delighted to be co-hosting today's workshop jointly with the Women's Foundation in honor of International Women's Day and under the banner of UN Women's He for She campaign, which Hong Kong U was one of the first 10 universities in the world to sign on to. The He for She campaign emphasizes the importance of men and women standing together to tackle gender issues. It's a significant movement which has over 1.3 billion ongoing conversations as of the weekend, possibly more now, and has attracted 672,000 He for She commitments globally. Professor Peter Matheson, who is an impact champion for He for She, will be sharing more about the significance of this campaign and his visions for it in Hong Kong and beyond in a moment. But I would also like to draw attention to the theme of this year's International Women's Day, which is women helping women. So as much as He for She is an important campaign, we are in dire need of augmenting She for She. And thank you to my colleague Stacey Ford for coining this amazing term for women's solidarity. Because many women undermine their counterparts too, and they also play a complicit role in their oppression. Each year since the early 90s, the Women's Studies Research Center has sponsored a spring workshop, an International Women's Day event, and co-sponsors numerous seminars across the university with NGOs and community groups. This year, we will be bringing various He for She events to you. Given the university's commitment to He for She, the WSRC will also be rebranding and hopes to engage a wider variety of stakeholders to inform our work and activities. To that end, we're calling for new membership, and I'd like to invite all of you to please join us, become a member. There are some sheets circulating, so please do sign up to our mailing list so that we can grow the community together and inform our work with your input. We are also going to be relaunching our website, so I hope to share sort of the details with you on that shortly. And we have an exciting spring workshop lined up in April on the 16th, when we will be discussing the Beijing Platform 20 years on and incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals into that discussion as well as to where we go forward in the lead up to 2030. We're also hoping to launch a Gender Plus event where we hope to be engaging disciplines across the campus to discuss and reflect on progress and the process of enhancing gender equity on campus. So I hope you'll join us in some of these endeavors and support our work. This is our second He for She event and our first collaboration with the Women's Foundation. The Women's Foundation has been a forerunner in putting gender on the map in Hong Kong with its programs, which focus on challenging gender stereotypes, empowering women in poverty, and women in leadership roles. Under these broad themes, the TWF does extensive work on a range of areas, including women in STEM, women on boards, financial literacy, mentorship, media representations of gender, and it works across numerous sectors, including the corporate sector, the NGO sector, and increasingly works with academics across universities in Hong Kong. We're very grateful to TWF, which is responsible for bringing Dr. Jackson Katz to Hong Kong to share with us his powerful and inspirational work on preventing and addressing gender violence and why it's a men's issue. Dr. Katz has a packed week in Hong Kong. He's just arrived, and he'll be speaking to a variety of stakeholders. We are uniquely privileged tonight to have the honor of hosting him for his very first in a series of events this week, and today he'll be speaking to us about his work on the bystander approach. Professor Matheson will be offering a more comprehensive introduction of our distinguished speaker shortly. But in my capacity as CCPL Director and as the co-convener of Women's Studies Research Center, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to one of the most leading experts on gender violence amongst us tonight. Welcome, Dr. Katz. I'm most delighted also to introduce you all to Sue-May Thompson. She's the CEO of TWF. Sue-May has many accolades to her name. I would like to highlight 3 of her most recent achievements, which I think speak volumes about her work, her passion, and her commitment to gender equity issues. Sume was honored with the 2015 AmCham Women of Influence Award for Nonprofit Leader of the Year and the HKAH Tatler Women of Hope Award for Power and Influence, and she has been recognized as one of Hong Kong's 100 most influential people. It is a great honor to be able to introduce someone of that caliber to share with us a few words tonight. Sume, if we could have you up here, please.
I'm in the wrong room. Thank you so much, Pooja. Thank you so much, Pooja, Stacey, and Peter, for inviting the Women's Foundation to partner with HKU on this event. At TWF, we care passionately about what is happening in our campuses in Hong Kong and what kind of adults we are developing at our universities. Students, we are interested in your views on gender equality and the status of women. We would like to think that you will all be leaving university feeling at ease with and excited about embracing a gender-equal world where men and women have a shared future as joint earners and carers. For this to happen, we need boys and young men to feel comfortable with and confident about their masculinity without having to resort to being aggressive towards or needing to diminish women. We need girls and young women to have strong self-esteem and self-belief, confidence in your abilities and choices. And we need university campuses to strongly promote a culture with zero tolerance for violence and harassment of women, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. So, Peter, Pooja, and HKU, we applaud you on your commitment to gender equality, and we would love to partner with you on future events and initiatives in future. One idea is potentially a roundtable where you share with other universities in Hong Kong what you're doing in this area. Another idea is for an on-campus screening of a new documentary that we are making at TWF. It's called She Objects, or She Objects, get it? And it is about how the media objectifies, sexualizes, and diminishes women. And we're going to be premiering this in May, and we'd love to show it here as well. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Peter, who is going to introduce Jackson. As Pooja said, Peter is a really inspiring example of a male leader as the UN's impact champion for he, for she, for Hong Kong. It's wonderful to have a male leader here who cares so deeply about these issues. So Peter, over to you, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Sume, and thank you, Pooja, for the invitation. Dr. Katz, welcome to the University of Hong Kong. I'm going to say it in a bit more detail in a minute, but you're very welcome here. I like it when Hong Kong U is the first to do anything. So I really liked it when Hong Kong U was the first to launch our commitment to he for she. We were the first university in the world. I kept on saying it, and I will keep on saying it because I'm proud of it. And if we're getting the first bite out of Dr. Katz's visit to Hong Kong, then I'm also very pleased about that. The figures that Pooja showed just now were quite extraordinary. I mean, the one that I wrote down, because I thought it was amazing, was that 97% of sexual harassment is reported to be by the boy or girlfriend. Is that, I mean, so I'm interested, we might come back to that in discussion. I just wonder if, is that typical, or is that something about Hong Kong? I don't know. I was really staggered by that figure. And maybe we'll pick up what that means about relationships or whatever. I think it's a very interesting figure. So anyway, I didn't intend to ad-lib, so on behalf of the University of Hong Kong, a very warm welcome to you all. I'm not going to say very much about he for she. I mean, there's plenty you can read about he for she, and I don't particularly want to talk about it or about my role in it, although I'm very happy to answer questions on it. Suffice to say, I think it's an initiative that I personally support, and I think the institution should support. I recognize it's not without its complications. I like Stacey's modification of she for she. Maybe we should have he for he and teach the men how to behave better in relationships. But anyway, there are some concerns about a binary definition of gender, and I recognize those things. But anyway, I still believe that there's enough mileage in the ideals of he for she for me to sign up to it. And I took the University of Hong Kong into it without discussing it with anybody. I just got a letter from the UN women, and I thought, this is a good idea. I said yes, and then I started just telling everybody about it. There was no consultation, which is not my normal management style, but I just felt this was so important that we should go for it. The launch we had here in April last year, when we had Elizabeth Naomi Yarrow from UN Women here, was the first university to make that commitment. There's been some progress in the 9 months since then towards some of the things that we set out to achieve, but my goodness, there's a long way to go. And this kind of event and this kind of awareness-raising event, I think, is the kind of thing that we want to do. Sume, I will publicly make you a commitment that we will show your documentary at the University of Hong Kong. You heard it here. If the Women's Studies Research Centre doesn't want to do it, I'll do it. Someone will do it anyway. But I'm sure they will want to. But we should have that kind of event. We should work with the Women's Foundation. We should work with everybody that believes in the same sort of ideals, and that's very much the principles of the university. So just one comment I would make about some of the activities at He for She. On Saturday morning, I opened a conference called Girls for Tech, which was aimed at secondary school girls, aiming to encourage them to come into technical, engineering and computing and coding type careers. Right here on campus, it was fantastic. And that's the kind of event that I think we should be doing much more of. At the moment, it's a little bit piecemeal, but we will do more. I'm reminded that one of the aspects of He for She that we haven't really addressed in very much detail, is the whole topic of gender-based violence, and that's why I think the focus of tonight's speech and tonight's event is very welcome. So I want to thank my colleagues in the Centre for Comparative and Public Law and the Women's Studies Research Centre who've made this possible. My thanks also to Sume and the Women's Foundation for their support and for their partnership with the university, because I do see it as a partnership that we need to push forward. I would have liked to have seen a few more men here. There are some men, but as always, when I address this kind of event, the audience is female dominated, and that in itself is an interesting issue that we might address. As Pooja and Stacey know, I've got an idea about how to address that. But anyway, it's a repeated issue. But at least there are some men here, and I hope that the men that are here today will talk to other men, because I think the message that you're going to hear is a very important one. Dr. Jackson Katz is better able than me to articulate all this, and I'm going to pass over to him. He's an American educator, author, filmmaker, and cultural theorist who's internationally renowned for his pioneering scholarship and activism on issues of gender and violence. He has a BA in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts-Amherst, a master's from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and a Ph.D. in cultural studies and education from UCLA. In 1993, Dr. Katz co-founded the multiracial mixed gender Mentors in Violence Prevention program, one of the longest running and most widely influential sexual assault and relationship abuse prevention programs in high schools, universities, sports culture, and the military in North America and beyond. Dr. Katz is a key architect of the popular Bystander approach to prevention. In 1997, he created and directed the first gender violence prevention program in the history of the US Marine Corps. Since then, he and his colleagues have been centrally involved in the development and implementation of system-wide prevention efforts in the United States Air Force, Navy, and Army. That must be quite a tough task. He served as a consultant and subject matter expert to various international organizations, including the World Health Organization and UN Women. He's the author of The Macho Paradox, Why Some Men Hurt Women and How All Men Can Help, and the forthcoming Man Enough, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. Now, there's a book I'm really looking forward to reading. He's an acclaimed public lecturer who speaks extensively in the United States and around the world on topics related to violence, media, and multiracial, multinational masculinities. His TED Talk, Violence Against Women as a Men's Issue, has been viewed more than 2.7 million times. I'm one of those 2.7 million. If anyone hasn't watched it, I recommend that you do. It's extremely good. But for us, there's no need now to go online. We have him here in person. So it's a great honor to have Dr. Jackson Katz here at the University of Hong Kong. Jackson, you're very welcome. Over to you.
So just before we invite Jackson up to the podium to share his work with us, to set the context, we're going to show you a few clips from The Hunting Ground, which is a movie or documentary rather, which presents the institutional barriers faced by victims in the campus context. And we hope that by looking at it from that perspective, it'll help inform our discussion later this evening. So we'll start with some of these clips, and then I'll invite Dr. Katz to deliver his talk.
There's a lot of victim blaming with this crime, which has a silencing effect on survivors.
If a student comes to an administrator with a problem, it's not as if the administrator wants that student to be harmed. It's not as if the administrator wants the harm to be perpetuated, but their first job is to protect the institution from harm, not the student from harm.
What you do is you make it difficult for students to report. So you don't have 200 or 1,000 reported assaults, or whatever the number would be on that campus. So you can artificially keep your numbers low. One really easy way when a lot of students report, they very much discourage them from going to the police. And that's because if it goes to the police, then it's more likely to end up kind of as a public record.
Colleges have been mandated for a long time to report the crimes that occur on campus to the federal government. But it is in the interest of the college to actually suppress all knowledge that that rape has happened.
There is a desire to have this addressed internally. And part of that is silencing the kind of problem. It's viewed as a public relations management kind of a problem, I would say.
Universities are protecting a brand. They're selling a product.
I got a call from the Dean of Admissions first asking, if you were to get in to Harvard, would you accept? And I said yes, because I knew my mom would kill me if I said anything else, but...
I had mentioned a little pressure, just a little. I saw it as a great opportunity. Harvard Law degree, wow.
I saw the inside of a courtroom during my second year of law school. It was insanely stressful, but also super rewarding. So, yeah, I really loved my second year there. It was during the winter term of my third year. I knew him really well. We'd met a couple of years earlier, the guy, and my girlfriend who was over. We all met at my apartment to have some drinks beforehand, and then we went out to this bar. He continued to buy us both more drinks. Half an hour into it, I noticed my girlfriend seemed wasted. People started to comment on how drunk my friend seemed. Almost instantly after we got into the taxi, I just felt this extremely heavy feeling come over me. My friend, she was just kind of passed out completely. It was like a maybe 10-minute ride back to my place. Me and my girlfriend kind of just flopped down face first on my bed. The next thing I remember, he was on top of me, and he had a hand inside of my underwear, and he was trying to put a finger inside of me. I yanked him by the hair, and I looked over and I just saw her naked back, and I know that she had fallen asleep with all of her clothes on. And so my next question was, why is she naked? And he smiled as he was still on top of me, fondling me with one hand, and he reached out and pet her naked belly and said, oh, I did that, I trust her. And I asked, you took off her bra? And he touched her naked breasts while she was still totally unconscious and said, yeah, I did that too. And the next day he texted me, and I said something very casually like, am I gonna have to tell her that she needs a pregnancy test? And he said in the text message, no, we didn't do anything serious. Maybe I'd put a finger in her V at most.
It seemed pretty clear that he had assaulted both of them while they were unconscious. I absolutely presume that Harvard would do right by Camila.
I went to the Dean of Students' office, and she said, I just want to make sure, like, above all else, that you don't talk to anyone about this. It could be bad for everyone if people started rallying around, like, having him removed from campus. And I was like, well, he's a predator, and he's dangerous, and actually that's exactly what I want. We both had the right to legal representation. My lawyer is pro bono.
She was a phenomenal client. She really told her story with a great deal of confidence.
I went into the hearing, and even the professors were like, did I give him the wrong message with our friendship, and that he misunderstood our friendship? My response was like, no, because, you know, sex was never part of that friendship. And if we were ever going to be introduced, when I was awake would be a good time for that. I'm getting questions like, why didn't you fight him? And he's like, I think like 6'3", over 200 pounds. I was unconscious or just coming to. I like could barely take control of my own body, but why didn't you fight him? There was this extreme reluctance to believe me.
Campus administrators are overly concerned about false reporting. If you look at statistics on false reporting, it's much, much smaller than what people estimate it to be.
The data about false rape claims is that they're a tiny minority of all reports ever made. Rape and sexual assault have the same percentage of false reports that any other crime has in our country.
The best research from around the world would put the percentage of false reports somewhere between 2 and 8%. Which means 90%, but more likely 95 to 98% of reports are not false.
We got done with the hearing probably at 4:30 or 5 o'clock, and they came back very quickly.
They had found that he had assaulted me.
When we got the call that he was expelled, she was in utter disbelief. That doesn't come very often with these college cases.
The next September, I came back to Cambridge and I got a Facebook message from the Dean of Students. She said that the assailant, he could appeal the ad board's decision, and they voted again on whether to uphold the decision to remove him and decided to let him back in.
The message is clear. It's don't proceed through these disciplinary hearings. No matter what you do, you're not going to win.
Lizzie always had this big, beautiful, radiant smile. It was electric, and it made other people happy. We had 11 family members attend Notre Dame and 2 family members, including Lizzie, that went to St. Mary's. And she, I think, really felt affirmed that this was the right choice. And she was really, really happy to be there. She went over on August 31st with a friend to attend an activities fair at Notre Dame. And that evening, they went back to this football player's room. it was four of them in there, the football player and his friend, and Lizzie and her friend. And then, I guess rather suddenly, the other two left the room and left Lizzie alone with this football player. And then he basically jumps her. He pulls her on top of him and removes her shirt and bra, and then also begins to try to take off her pants. And the next day, Lizzie reports, it never crossed our mind that they wouldn't do right. The accused, they couldn't find him. They had difficulty locating him. Everyone knows where this individual is. Certainly the athletic department knows. He played 2 home football games before he was interviewed. Notre Dame Stadium holds 80,000 people, so that's times 2, 160,000 people knew where this guy was before the Notre Dame security police could find him.
There is a directive that the campus police cannot contact an athlete at any athletic facility, and we cannot contact any athletic employee to assist us in contacting the athlete that we would be looking for.
So what was the point of that?
I guess just to keep us away from student athletes.
So Lizzie ends this exchange of intimidating texts from the football player's friend, and he comes at her with a text: "Don't do anything you would regret. Messing with Notre Dame football is a bad idea." And then Lizzie takes that message and immediately forwards it to the detective in charge. And later, the county prosecutor said that they would not be filing any charges on that particular complaint, and saying that it wasn't a threat because the individual who sent it believed he was trying to prevent someone from filing a false report. She was becoming very anxious about this whole situation. One of her friends is quoted as saying that she said, he's going to get away with it. He denied everything and made comments like she was the aggressor. Friday evening, I finally looked at my phone and I saw a text from my wife's best friend saying, you need to call right away. And I remember the words, and it was, it's bad. It's bad. Lizzie took her life today. She's gone. It's brutal. Just really profoundly sad in those moments when you just think she's not here with us.
I'd now like to invite Dr. Katz, please. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, you've just seen, it's kind of an emotional film, and I'll try to reframe the discussion back towards the prevention of the kind of sad stories that we just saw. I mean, that's kind of real life example of the failure of systems and prevention and social change and engaging men. That's the worst of it. But let me just say, shifting gears, that this is a great honor for me. Thank you very much. Pooja, thank you very much. And Sume, for your leadership and advocacy, to say the least, and bringing me to Hong Kong and doing all the different things, the centerpiece being right now And Peter, thank you very much for those kind introductory remarks, and thank you all for being here. Is it? Thank you. By the way, can I ask a question about process? Is it going to offend Hong Kong University sensibilities if I step up from behind this podium? Okay, thank you. Oh yeah. It won't destroy my intellectual authority if I'm. You sure? All right. I think I'll do it. And can I share with you an anecdote from my own experience that makes sense of why I even asked you if I could step from behind the podium? I do a lot of talks and a lot of trainings all over the United States and parts of the world. And about 4 years ago, I was in Palm Springs, California, to do a 3-hour block of instruction with a group of police chiefs, high officials in the police throughout Southern California, and there was 90 of these chiefs, and 97% of them men, and the vast majority of them white men, a very conservative group, as you might expect, police officials. And I was introduced to the group, and I hadn't been in the room prior because there had been somebody on stage, and the door to the room was next to the podium, and so I walked into the room, I stood behind the podium, and I got a sense from the body language from the chiefs that there was some resistance, if you will. And maybe I'm projecting, but I got the sense that there was this attitude of like, who is this guy? And what are we going to have to do? Sit here for 3 hours and listen to him? And who put him on the agenda? And I didn't get a very warm feeling. And so I knew I had 3 hours. And so I said, do you mind if I step out from behind the podium? Thinking I would loosen them up. And one of the chiefs yells out, yeah, it makes you a better target. So it didn't start out particularly well. But I have to say, as an educator, let's go. I'm fine. Let's have, he's not going to intimidate me for 1 millisecond. Let's have it out. And I knew from the moment that Chief opened his mouth that he had given me a great gift, which is, of course, an anecdote that I shared with you at Hong Kong University several years later. So I swear to God, from the moment that Chief opened his mouth, I knew that he had given me this great gift. And however, inadvertently, he was supporting my work. Now, I don't feel the same level of, defensive hostility that I did maybe that day, but I haven't really said much of anything provocative, and I'm going to say some provocative things. And again, I sense that there's, a lot of people who want to hear some angles and perspectives rather than you were dragged into the room. But I'm going to share with you a bunch of things in the short time that I and we have. And we're going to have some interactive exercises as well as, questions/comments. So it's not just going to be me talking, but I'll talk a lot, but there'll be opportunities for you to ask questions and push in different directions and such. But it's going to go quickly because there's just so much, and I'm only going to scratch the surface. But I hope to make some powerful points, and if you're interested in this conversation, I'll point you in directions where you can get much more. Resources, ideas, websites, materials. Excuse me. I did just get in, by the way, from LA earlier today, so I'm still trying to get my Hong Kong time, going. That's why I'm drinking water. Water has such an accelerant effect on your limbic system. Just kidding. So let me also begin by saying that I understand fully that I'm a white American heterosexual man wearing a suit, and I'm coming here and I'm going to speak to you about issues of gender and gender violence and engaging men and all these other issues. And I appreciate that there's cultural and ethnic complexities in Hong Kong society that are not, that I'm not fully aware of. I've done some research and I've been here. This is my second time in this great place, but I'm not presuming to know all the complexities of what you're dealing with. But I'm going to share with you the perspective that I and my colleagues have developed in multiracial, multi-ethnic environments in the United States and elsewhere, and you can figure out, if you so desire, how to plug in some of these ideas and concepts into your own context. Is that fair enough? Okay, because I'm quite aware, again, because a big part of my work is about, and Peter is also doing this kind of work, but he suggested in his introduction to me, a big part of my work is about engaging men, right? And I'm going to begin this particular piece by just giving you a couple paradigm-shifting perspectives. Before I get to the bystander approach and the concrete manifestations of prevention on university campuses and such, I want to give you some conceptual pieces so that you have a sense of where I am coming from in this work. So the first is that I think we need a new paradigm in our understanding of gender violence issues. And when I say gender violence, I'm talking about sexual harassment is one of them, sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. There's so many gender violence issues. But historically, and even to this day in 2016, most people understand gender violence issues as women's issues, fundamentally, that some good men help out with. That's the context that so many people have. It's like these are fundamentally women's issues, and there are good men who support women, who support women's efforts, personally, privately, as well as publicly. And that's the status quo. And I have a big problem with that. I don't even accept the premise. I don't see these issues as women's issues that some good men help out with. In fact, I'm going to argue that these are men's issues. Of course, they're also women's issues, and so it's important also that I say this, and with International Women's Day around the corner and such. I mean, it's important that I say, that men say, women's leadership has been incredibly transformative all over the world. I mean, women's leadership has been just incredible. I mean, there wasn't even any such thing as a rape crisis center until the 1970s. Men had been raping women and children and other men for thousands of years. But there weren't services for victims and survivors. There weren't counselors on university campuses. The police weren't trained. I mean, again, this is an ongoing struggle. I appreciate that. But none of this had even existed before the 1970s. In other words, the services to victims, the accountability for offenders. And by the way, when I say the accountability for offenders, we just saw an example of how systems in the United States are failing to hold accountable offenders, right? But even on a fundamental level, rape within marriage, which is still, there's hundreds of millions of people in the world who live in societies where rape is legal within marriage. To this day, as we speak. And in the United States, there was several states in the United States where rape was legal in marriage as recently as 30 years ago. It's not that long ago, but who were the people that drove the reform of the laws to make rape, illegal within marriage in the United States and elsewhere, as well as holding offenders accountable on various levels? In addition to providing services to victims and survivors, it was women, and in a multicultural, multi-ethnic sense, women. And the social terrain in which those women operated was a lot less welcoming than it is even today in 2016. It's incredible what those women have done. And in many of my talks, I go into some detail about the positive effects on men and boys of women's leadership in this area. Because I think a lot of people, they have a misconception. They think, okay, women and girls have benefited from women's leadership in the sexual assault field or in the domestic violence field. I mean, domestic violence movement really only kicked in the 1970s. There was no such thing as a battered women's shelter or anything like that until the 1970s. I mean, this is very recent in historic terms if you think about the long sweep of human history. But anyway, most people think of this activism and women's leadership as helping women and girls. So there are services for victims and survivors. There are accountability that didn't exist before. There are prevention programs. And of course, that's true to a certain extent, but it's also true that men and boys have been affected in a positive way. And again, for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you a couple of quick examples of how men and boys have benefited. But please know that I could spend the rest of the time here and much more than that talking just about the positive value for men and boys of women's leadership in the gender violence field. But the two quick ones are, we're talking in the United States about and North America and elsewhere about the effects of domestic violence on children, all the children who are growing up and being traumatized by an adult man's abuse of their mother, whether it's their father, the mother's girlfriend, boyfriend, all the children who are traumatized. In the United States, we say children who witness domestic violence. Do you use that term? Children who witness domestic violence? This is a term that I don't like and I don't use. You know why? Because if you're a 7-year-old kid cowering in the witnessing, or in fact who are being traumatized by domestic violence by their father, in particular by a man assaulting their mother. Sometimes there's an abusive mother, and this is true in gay, male, and lesbian relationships and all kinds of other arrangements. But the category of children who are being traumatized includes not only girls, but also boys. And do you have any idea how many boys, even in Hong Kong as we speak, are living in situations where they're being thusly traumatized? And do you have any idea how many boys end up committing antisocial behavior partly in response to violence, victimization in their childhoods, in their families of origin, in their youth? Have any idea? I mean, the prisons of the United States are filled, the adult prisons are filled with chronologically adult men who underneath are little boys who didn't take the right path, often made bad choices in response to victimization, and one of those bad paths that they took, which is suggested in media culture and everywhere else, which is the narrative is, if somebody took something from me, I'm going to take it from somebody else, which is why boys who have been abused are something like 10 times more likely to become abusive of others than boys who haven't been abused. It's not, quantum physics. It's not that complicated. But this is what's going on. And I often say in the United States, which is we have a system of mass incarceration that's shameful, that we have to talk about, when we talk about, the United States has 5% of the world's population, 25% of the incarcerated people in the world. It's shameful, our system. And we have to talk about poverty and racism as two major systems that end up, that shape who ends up in prison. But we also have to talk about violence done to boys and men, because if you go into these prisons, which I've done myself, and I worked when I was in my 20s with adolescent males in detention centers, it's just like one after the other. These boys and these men have trauma and violence in their backgrounds. And if you want a bumper sticker that summarizes this concept right here, there's no about the connection between violence done to boys and violence done by boys. There's no peace on the streets if there's no peace at home. There's no peace in the community if there's no peace in the family. There's no peace in the world if there's no peace at home. So much of the bad behavior committed by boys and men has its origins, at least in part, in violence done to boys. States, for example, where we have mass murders virtually weekly, and you probably know this, it's just amazing how common it is and how desensitized we've become to it. There was a study recently that showed something like 57% of mass murders in the United States over the past decade or so, 57% have links to domestic violence, which is to say the perpetrator has either a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence. I mean, it's not a coincidence. So the women who built the battered women's movement and started talking about these issues and try to hold adult men accountable and try to reform the laws and everything, who often get called male bashers. They hate men. They've got an agenda against men. It's actually the best thing that could happen to boys and men is for somebody to have started calling out and holding perpetrators of violence and trying to redefine masculinity in healthier ways, not just because it's going to help women, but because it's going to help men and boys. I mean, to me, it's so obvious. But that needs to be said out loud, I think, and especially from those of us who are men who are in a position to say some of this stuff, because some of the women who do this work get constantly ridiculed and shouted down and called, man-hating, what? And it's just so unfair and so wrong. And the other piece, and it connects to the Oscars. Does anybody watch the Oscars a couple nights ago? How many people watched the Oscars? Admit it, please, if you did. Just a few people. Okay. Well, what won Best Picture? Does anybody remember? Spotlight. Okay. You know what Spotlight was about? It was about my home city, Boston. The Boston Globe, the main newspaper, had an investigative team that uncovered the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal back in the late 90s, around 2000. And it went global after that. They did this incredible investigative work to reveal this pattern of incredible abuse and then cover up by the church hierarchy in a very Catholic city, Boston. And so they were working against the power structure in that sense. And they just won Best Picture. And anyways, but the point I'm making here is we're talking increasingly about male sexual victimization in our society and in the world. Men have been sexually assaulting other men and boys for thousands and thousands of years, but we've only been talking about it for about 15, not even 15 to 20 years. Why are we talking about it now? Because the feminist-led women's movements against sexual violence and domestic violence that started in the 1970s created the paradigm for victims to reclaim the narrative of their life and claim survivor status rather than victim status. I'm not going to be shamed into silence. He's the one who should be ashamed of himself, not me. The kind of reclamation of personal sort of strength and narrative. That was a feminist-led movement that has now provided the space and the paradigm for so many young men, brave young men and older men, and to come forward and get the services and have systems start being responsive. All of this is benefiting men, the male victims of sexual violence in this case, as well as the female. But how often do you hear feminist women getting credit for an increased sensitivity towards and concern and compassion for male sexual assault victims, who are most cases the victims of other men's sexual assault? You don't hear it very often at all. Again, it's unfair and wrong, but again, men like myself are in a position to say this out loud, so I thought I would say it out loud. So men and boys have been benefiting dramatically from women's leadership in all these areas, but still, the very act of calling domestic and sexual violence issues women's issues is, I think, part of the problem. And in part because it gives men an excuse not to pay attention, right? A lot of men hear the term women's issues and we tend to tune it out. A lot of men like, I'm a guy, that's for the girls, that's for the women. And a lot of men don't get beyond the first sentence. It's like a chip in our brain is activated and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the word women's issues. This is also true of the word gender, because a lot of people hear that word, gender, and they think it means women. And a lot, I mean, there's some confusion about the term gender. And actually, let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. This is I'm going to use the U.S. as my reference point, but you can plug in Hong Kong analog. In the U.S., when people hear the word, let's talk about race, okay, for a moment. Race, when people hear in the United States the word race, they tend to think it means African American, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander, Latino, etc. When people hear the word sexual orientation, they tend to think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual, and when people hear the word gender, they tend to think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to, as if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct, as if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation, as if men don't have a gender. Again, this is basic stuff. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance. Because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, is the ability to go unexamined and lacking introspection. And the way this plays out in the discourse about sexual assault and domestic violence and sexual harassment is you hear lots of passive language and lots of passive voice. So you'll hear people ask questions like, how many women in Hong Kong were raped last year, rather than how many men raped women, in Hong Kong. Girls in, the Hong Kong Unified School District were harassed year, rather than how many boys harassed girls, or how many girls harassed girls, or how many teenage girls got pregnant last year, rather than how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls. In each case, the use of the passive voice has a very powerful political effect. The political effect is the shift in focus off of the group with more power onto the group with less power. This is not a coincidence, it's not sloppy thinking, it's how power functions, in this case through stealth or invisibility and through the shifting of accountability. Even the term violence against women is problematic, a term I don't use. Why? What's missing from the term, more honest? I know there's women's violence against women. I appreciate that. There's mother-to-daughter child abuse, there's lesbian battering, there's female-to-female, peer-to-peer harassment, abuse, and violence. But let's be clear, the vast majority of violence against women in the world is done by men, and the overwhelming majority of sexual violence against women is done by men, but you wouldn't know that from the phrase violence against women. Again, this is all basic stuff, and I just wanted to share with you. I'm talking fast because I'm trying to get through it, but there's lots of stuff here that needs to be rethought if we want to shift the paradigm. And part of what needs to happen is we need to be engaging men at much more fundamental levels. And so what I'm suggesting to you is part of that is thinking about how we're thinking about this subject matter and how we use language and how unaccountable that language is. And when Peter said right at the beginning that, there's not enough men in this room, which, I concur, I appreciate there are men in the room, but not enough. I'll get to that, but I want to say, I would get to that in terms of what I think needs to happen, in terms of counteracting that, but that's the status quo for the last, 45 years or 50 years, right? Is that women's leadership, women engage, and a handful of good men come and support or learn or take this class or attend this rally or support this check for this organization or support a woman in our lives who are addressing this issue more fundamentally, but most men just go on their way. And it's not like my issue. It's not my issue. I'm not going to, and that's going to change, obviously. So this brings us to the way, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a mini history of how I and my colleagues came to develop this approach to prevention of gender violence on university campuses, on high schools, in the military, in the sport culture. It has wide applicability, but I'm going to give you the mini history because it'll give you some context, and then we're going to get into a little bit of a experiential piece with the material, okay? Now, I'm going to move this into the front. So, back in 1993, I was a graduate student in Boston. By the way, has anybody here been to Boston? Good, some people, good. Anybody here from Boston? Okay. It's okay, I'm curious. Has anybody picked up a Boston accent in my speech? Have you? I mean, you might not have, but have you? Has anybody? Do you know what a Boston accent is? I mean, are you familiar with a Boston accent? There's so many Hollywood movies with Boston, locations. But I have it's moderated a little bit. I used to have a much stronger Boston accent. But that was just an aside, meaningless to the larger point I'm trying to make. But I was in graduate school in Boston, and I approached the director of an institute at another university, Northeastern University. The institute was called the Center for the Study of Sport in Society. That had been created in 1984 with the idea of using the sports culture as the catalyst for social justice activism, especially around the issue of racism. And in the U.S. culture, but also in world culture, sport plays an incredibly important role in social justice movements in various ways, because sports is much more than just playing fields or the pitch or the court or the ice or whatever. It's much bigger. It has much bigger social significance and a role in socialization of girls and boys and social norms and all kinds of stuff. And racism and sport issues are just incredibly intersecting and overlapping, especially in the States, where I'm from. And the director of the institute, Richard Lapchick, was one of the organizers of the Olympic boycott of South Africa during the apartheid era. The idea was to isolate the racist apartheid regime in South Africa by refusing to play in international sporting competitions with them. That's an example of the use of sports as a sort of social and political activist tool. And I knew about all this, and I approached Lapchick, the director, with this idea of creating a program to train university male student athletes. Now, I understand in the States we have a huge system. It's a huge institution of university athletics there's not a good analog here in Hong Kong. But in the States, university athletics is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's a giant thing, okay? And my thought was, let's create a program that will train male student athletes at the university level to speak out about rape and sexual assault and relationship abuse. And you saw, in that little clip from Hunting Ground, how the sport culture is in some cases right at the heart of patriarchal culture that denies rape and ex-perpetrators. My idea is you've got to go right into the center. If you're going to just play on the margins, if we're just going to have initiatives that take place on the margins of hegemonic power, it's not going to change anything. You've got to go right into the heart of it. And I was thinking, we've got to go right into the heart of sports culture and get guys to start speaking out on these subjects. And by the way, most football players at Notre Dame are not rapists. Most of them are not abusers. Yes, there's perpetration in those institutions, but there's also a lot of guys who are just doing their thing. They're going to school, they're playing sports, they're good people. What we need more of them to start speaking out. And my thinking was, if we get guys who already have status within their peer culture to be leaders, it'll open up space well beyond the athletic subculture. In other words, it was a strategic plan to mainstream these ideas in male culture. And that was my goal when I started the MVP. It's called Mentors in Violence Prevention. MVP, which is also most valuable player in sports, which is the best thing you can be in the sports context in the United States, is the most valuable player. on your team, so it's a positive thing. So we got funding from the United States Department of Education to create this model program. And the question is, initially it was only for men, not for women and men or anybody else. It was only men. The question is, what are we going to say to these young men on university football, basketball, baseball, hockey, soccer, all the different sports? What are we going to say to them that invites them into the conversation rather than indicts them as potential rapists and abusers? You follow me on that? And this is, and the context for that invite rather than indict is that back in the 1970s, I hope you can see this, I'm sorry. It's not, the grandest of artwork, but back in the 1970s, on university campuses in the United States, the way that people thought about, say, sexual assault prevention was organized around binary understanding, women and men, and we weren't thinking beyond the binary back then, and in the mainstream. And most efforts that called themselves prevention efforts back in the 1970s were not really prevention efforts. They were risk reduction efforts aimed at girls and women, but they called them prevention. So risk reduction is different from prevention. Risk reduction means, look in the back seat of your car before you get in. Have a man's voice on your voicemail. Or back in the 70s, we had no voicemail. I just wanted to say that in case somebody caught me on this. Back in the 1970s, it wasn't voicemail. It was answering machines. And you were lucky if you had one, right? Today, it's voicemail, and it's a totally different technological, universe that we live in, obviously. But anyways, when you're drinking alcohol, make sure that you have a buddy system when you're going out with a group of friends, check in with friends. All this list of things, this mental checklist of things that girls and women to this day are taught as part of being a woman or a girl in urban areas, suburban areas, rural areas, cutting across all the different ethnicities. That's not prevention, that's risk reduction. Because true prevention means going to the root cause of the problem, and girls and women aren't raping themselves, okay? So, when men and boys were focused on, again, back in the day, it was almost always as perpetrators or potential perpetrators. So the spirit of the message to guys, the educational message was, you guys better listen up. You better know the laws in Hong Kong about consent, especially sexual consent, especially involving alcohol. You need to know that if she or he is not consenting under the law, you could be committing rape, and you need to step back. The problem with focusing on men as perpetrators or potential perpetrators is that a lot of men just shut you off immediately and say, who do you come in and talking to me like I'm a perpetrator? I just resent that. I'm a good person. I'm not going to be talked to like I'm a walking potential perpetrator. And it's understandable. Who wants to be talked to in that way? Now, I know that people need to know the law. They need to know what consent is. And obviously, men, women, everybody needs to know the law. But my thought was, how do we get men to buy into the idea that they have to be part of the solution here? They have to be part of the positive solution rather than be a defensive crouch so that they don't become blamed. There's a different way to do it. And so at the time, this is back in the early 90s, I had a graduate school who, along with his colleagues at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, was looking at an approach to middle school bullying prevention. Middle school, 12, 13-year-olds, bullying prevention that moved beyond the perpetrator-victim binary and focused on everybody else. So in other words, instead of focusing on the kid doing the bullying, it focused on everybody around the kid doing the bullying. And the goal of that was to get the kids to say to that kid, this is not okay. The way you're acting is not okay. The way you're treating other kids is not okay. Not just because you're going to get in trouble with the authority figures, but because in the peer culture don't accept this behavior at all within our peer culture, right? It's not just an invocation of authority. It's like, we don't accept this. You're violating our sort of social. And it's to get kids around, targeted by the bullying, to say, we support you. What's happening to you is wrong. We're on your side, and how can we help you? Rather than, pretending that, we're not going to get involved, or pretending that it's not our business. In other words, the point is, how do you bring everybody into the conversation? And in male culture, the beauty, I think, of that approach was, and by the way, we imported that approach from the bullying world in middle schools into the sexual assault and relationship abuse field. The beauty of that approach in working with men was that it it moved beyond men as perpetrators or potential perpetrators and gave all men a role to play. It gave all of us a way to be part of the solution in a positive way. Now, a key point, and we call it the bystander approach, by the way, and that's, I forgot to write that in. A bystander is anybody who's not a perpetrator or a victim in any given situation, in any given social context or peer culture or community. Because I think of it much more broadly than just the person who's there at the moment of attack. I'm thinking of everybody in a given peer culture community. If they're not a perpetrator or a victim, they are a bystander. It's friends, it's teammates, it's classmates, it's co-workers, it's colleagues, all of us who play roles in social universes are bystanders. And we're either passive or we're active, but we're all in this category of bystander. And the goal is to move people from passive to active. But one other key concept, if you can see this triangle, imagine it as a pyramid. And then imagine that the tip of the pyramid is a sexual assault incident, or a domestic violence incident, or a sexual harassment incident, or a gay bashing incident, or a bullying incident. But then imagine the base of the pyramid is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that create the cultural context and foundation within which the abusive act takes place. It opens up a lot more space for what we're saying a bystander do. In other words, we're not just saying that when a person sees a rape in progress at a party at Hong Kong University, they need to jump in and stop the rape from happening. That's a very narrow and reductive understanding of what is a bigger concept, okay? It's not just about that. It's about challenging and interrupting sexist attitudes and beliefs as they come out. So, for example, if you're a guy and you're hanging out with a group of guys and a couple of guys start making really sexist and degrading comments about girls or women, and there's no girls or women even in the room, you're a member of that group of guys, and you don't say anything. You don't say, like, hey, what are you talking about there? It's not right. What are you saying is not right. Or some way of interrupting and challenging what they're saying. Then, in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity in their enactment of sexism? Just like if you were a white person in a room full of white people who are making racist comments and telling racist and degrading comments and jokes to people of color, if you don't say something to interrupt that, in a sense, isn't your silence a form of consent and complicity in their racism? And if you're a heterosexual person, same thing. This is basic social justice education concepts, okay? These are basic concepts. Well, what we were saying in the bystander approach working with men was guys need to start challenging and interrupting other guys when they start acting in sexist ways. This has to be something that they internalize, not just do it and get in trouble, don't do it, but they have to internalize it as part of their identity, who they are as a person, as a human being. And that's what we've been teaching in the MVP, Mentors in Violence Prevention model, for years. Now, one quick point about the term bystander intervention, and then I'm gonna ask Jess and Jackie to help me hand out some actual scenarios. I'll go through that pretty quickly, but I don't want to overwhelm you with the sort of shop talk from my work in the States, but I have to tell you one piece, okay? Because what's happened in the last 10 years or so is that a lot of programs have developed in the States that have taken the core concepts of my program, MVP, about the bystander, and they've emptied them of their social justice foundation and feminist foundation, and they've taken gender out of the equation. So they use degendered language, and they talk about what people can do, what bystanders, as some disembodied, subject, the bystander can do to interrupt or challenge abuse. And the term that they've used to describe that is bystander intervention. And what the term intervention does is it pushes people's attention to the point of attack. In other words, intervention at the point of attack, as opposed to a broader sensibility about your responsibility to your peers, to yourself, taking into account your social position. Follow me on this? So the term bystander intervention, just please know that I have a particular point of view on what's effective in this work. And I think that some of the programs that go under the name of bystander intervention are not effective because they don't talk honestly about the social, ethnic, racial, gender sort of discourses and peer culture norms that are incredibly important in all of this. And so That's why I don't like the term bystander intervention, because it's not just about intervening at the point of attack. It's about a broader sensibility. Okay? So that's just a point of information. Now, what these folks are handing out are 3 different scenarios from some of our teaching material. Could you do me a favor and take out the one illegal motion? And let me say, the names of these scenarios aren't going to resonate with people who aren't, say, American football fans. You know what I mean? Like, illegal motion is a term from United States football. So if you were ever to do something in Hong Kong, you wouldn't name it illegal motion. Do you know what I mean? You'd come up with some resonant term locally. Illegal motion, does everybody have that? This is an example, and I'm cutting right to this because in MVP, in our model, we don't just go right to these scenarios. We have all kinds of exercises. We talk about leadership. We talk about gender norms. But then we get to the heart of the bystander approach. We get to these scenarios. And we put young men or young women into real-life situations, and we strategize them what to do, or the pros and cons of doing this or that. And it's very engaging and interactive, not a lecture. It's not a presentation. We don't have a PowerPoint presentation. It's about getting people, men and women, to have honest dialogues. And we do have all male and all female, or all men and all women discussions, as well as mixed gender. But there's a very different conversation that takes place. If it's all men or all women, it's very different than if it was mixed. But we're going to do the mix. We have a mixed room, obviously, right now, so we're going to do it. But could somebody do me a favor, just for the sake of today's workshop, read the scenario out loud, the top piece. Somebody want to do that, please? Thank you. Could somebody read the train of thought, please? Thank you. So what we do, like in MVP, once we've gone through these other exercises and we're getting to the heart of the bystander action, is we have somebody read this scenario, then we have somebody read the train of thought, and then the facilitators or the co-facilitators, it's better to have 2 co-facilitators, lead a discussion. Again, it's not a lecture. And the goal of the discussion is to get people to start thinking outside of the box of perpetrator-victim. So I'll give you some examples of the kind of questions that a facilitator would use in this scenario. One of them would be, why do you think a guy at Hong Kong University who sees this going on, which could be the precursor to a rape, because some rapes on college campuses start out at parties in situations like this, why would a guy, in this case a guy, because it could be a woman, but this is a scenario that's focusing on a guy, why would a guy see this and not say anything or do anything? Because we know it happens, regularly, where guys are at parties or they see a situation and they don't say anything. What are some of the reasons? I'm asking you. Could you just give me a handful of examples or ideas about why a guy in this situation might not say something or do something? There's no right or wrong answers here. This is just ideas. Okay, they might not want to get into a fight. Okay, thank you. They think it's just a woman's problem. Okay.
It won't do any good.
Okay, it won't do any good anyways, like futile. It's futile. Okay.
They're waiting for someone else to step in.
Waiting for someone else to step in. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, they believe it's acceptable by their community. Okay, this is good. I mean, again, we could go on and more, and I could give you more examples, and we'll talk about. In other words, there's lots of reasons why people don't intervene. Right? There's an ideology. In other words, there's a belief system that underpins some of these answers that people are making about she deserves it, it's not, or either she deserves it, or it's normative behavior, or there's fear of violence. There's all kinds of different reasons why people don't. Right? Do you know the word CB? Like that's a shortened version of a word. It's in the American context. What that is, a CB? Has anybody heard that term? This guy knows? But he doesn't want to say it out loud? Okay, thank you. Cock block. Yes, how many people know the word cock block? Have you heard it before? Actually, let me ask the question. How many people have never heard the word cock block until this minute? Okay, so I'm going to make a prediction. Some people in this room who just raised their hand go home tonight or, tomorrow at work, and somebody's going to say, go to that, talk on Bystander, and you'll say, yeah, and they'll say, did you learn anything? Was it interesting? It's like, yes, we learned a new word, cock block, common word in the States. And it's not a term of endearment. It's when a guy gets in the way of another guy trying to have sex, basically with a woman. You're cock blocking. It's a negative thing. So there's like disincentives all over the place for guys to speak up. And so part of what we do in MVP is just get this stuff to the surface. Let's talk about this. What does it mean to be a cock blocker? And then we talk about, I'll also ask questions, or we who lead these discussions will ask questions like, in addition to what I just asked, will be things like, do you have a responsibility? If you're a guy at a party and you see a guy friend in a situation where he might be about to commit what could be a rape, do you have responsibility to the woman in the situation? Do you have responsibility to the guy in the situation? Do you have responsibility to yourself? And let's go one by one and talk about it. Because a lot of people haven't even thought about, like, what's your responsibility to your guy friend? If he's your friend and he's doing something that could be not just harming her, but potentially could be harming him because he could be committing rape, actually charged with rape, etc. And he's your friend. What is the responsibility to him? What does it mean to be a friend? I mean, and then we contrast that with what people will say 5 minutes before, which is, you don't want to be a cock blocker, you don't want to get into a fight, you don't want to get into some conflict with your boy. But he could get in trouble, and he's your friend, and you see it, and you don't say anything? What does it mean to be a friend? I mean, let's talk about that. Like, what does it mean to be a friend? I mean, these are basic things that we talk about and bring to the surface in this pedagogy. And talk honestly about the pressures on boys and men to conform to certain norms. I don't want to be a cock blocker, And it's totally unexamined, because once you bring it to the surface and talk about it, it becomes ridiculous. And, by the way, we define the guy who speaks up, the person who is the bystander, in this case a man who takes risks and speaks up and challenges, not as a soft guy who's not a real man. That's ridiculous. It's like, actually, it takes more strength as a guy to challenge other men and interrupt other men who are enacting abusive behaviors. That takes so much more strength than just being one of the guys, going along with the guys. That takes nothing special. Being one of the guys, if you're a guy, give me a break. What takes something special is a guy who has the courage and the strength and the integrity and the moral integrity to say, this is wrong, dude, you can't do this. That takes so much more strength. And so we talk about all this in this pedagogy. And then we get to I'm short-handed. I know time is not my ally, but then we go to the options. We're not going to do that now, but we go to the options. We have people read the options, talk about what are the pros and cons of this or that. It becomes very interesting dialogue. The gestalt, the overall sort of tone setting is, you got to say something, you got to challenge, you got to interrupt, or you're just perpetuating the problem. Don't tell people you need to do this or that, because context is everything. People have to make decisions based on their comfort level, based on their assessment of the situation. We can't tell them. We can help them, however, think through the sort of moral decision-making process and then give them concrete, ideas, and then they can hear among their peer culture other people who are saying the same thing. Because, by the way, a lot of guys think they're the only one in a room or in a group who is uncomfortable with the behavior of some of the guys in the group. If they think they're the only one, they're much less likely to say anything because they feel like they're going to get isolated, they're going to have social repercussions. But if they realize from having gone through these processes that a lot of guys are uncomfortable with the behavior of some of us, guys will have more strength to say something and do and act on their best instincts because they've already seen that there's a lot of guys who the bullying behavior. Can I ask you this? Just do me a favor, and I'm speaking quickly, and I know that people have to leave when they have to leave, and we're going over time. If you just do me a favor and take out the down-over scenario, we're not going to go through it, but the down-over scenario is one of the other ones. I just wanted to point out that it's not just sexual assault we deal with domestic violence and relationship abuse. Down-over is also a social media or a technology scenario because we've integrated the social media and technologies of communication into this whole approach. Because, let's be clear, that's where the world is. I mean, the world is moving in the direction of technological shift in human interaction, and it's important to integrate that into the bystander approach. So down over is a scenario that deals with a piece of gender violence, but it comes at it from a different angle. Somebody just read the scenario out loud. Yeah, please.
Your friend comes and says his girlfriend's text messages asking her where she is, who she's with, what she's doing. This isn't just friendly chat. You get the feeling that he's
Thank you. Could somebody read the train of thought, please?
I'm not sure this is any of my business. After all, I wouldn't want other kids messing with my relationships. Then again, this doesn't seem right. He's really trying to control her, and this can't be healthy. I know some girls who think that guys who are jealous must really love them a lot, but I've seen materials from relationship abuse programs that explains how this kind of behavior can lead to physical abuse. Could this be one of those relationships? And again, a lot of kids text a lot. Who am I to say that when it's too much? And if I do say something, he might go off on me. What should I do in this situation?
Thank you very much. Now, one piece of this particular scenario that's different than, say, a potential sexual assault scenario is this is a more subtle, we're trying to help people think about how there are other ways of detecting problems that might lurk under the surface. It's not just that you're seeing him beat her up. It's like you're seeing a kind of behavior that's, you hadn't been trained, you hadn't been part of an educational process. You wouldn't have thought about it maybe as being problematic, as being potentially a precursor to a physical abuse, and it could arguably be an indication of currently existing controlling behavior or abuse that's even going on right now. If you're not trained in it, how are you going to know any of this? So that's part of the training becomes to be spotting things a little bit more thoughtfully, and then figuring out, again, we go through the options, we go through the pros and cons of, your responsibility to her, to him, to yourself, all that stuff. It's pretty basic stuff. But I have to tell you, when you get young people and older people engaged in these conversations, people really get a lot out of it, and they begin to start thinking about themselves in their peer cultures in a different way, and it's very positive. The last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll open up the floor for any comments, questions, is I guess it's a sort of wrapping up kind of comment, but bystander approach and leadership approach are two sides of the same coin, because when a bystander acts, when a friend or a teammate or a peer who sees abuse or sees some kind of mistreatment speaks up and challenges or interrupts or what have you, that's what a leader does. A leader is somebody who sees a situation and says, you know what, I'm in a position to do something about this, and maybe there's going to be positive consequences or negative consequences, but it's the right thing to do. I have to do something, and that they act. So we call the bystander approach really a leadership approach, and I want to broaden this out because I think that the issue, as I said at the beginning, is really a leadership issue, and this is true here at Hong Kong University. If men and women, but in particular men in positions of leadership, like Peter, but others who aren't in this room, would say, you know what, we are going to be leaders on this subject matter, and we're going to be preventive, and we're going to take this on in a much more sort of ahead of the curve kind of way, and be beacons of light, if you will, in the Hong Kong society, because we play that role anyways at Hong Kong University. This is just so much you can do. There's just because this approach applies to so many issues and well beyond the walls of Hong Kong University, because this is much bigger than what happens, when students are at campus. These are societal problems that are bigger and they're global problems. And we're trying to educate young people, men and women and others, to be, engaged citizens of their community, of their society, and of the world. And this is not the only approach in the whole world, but it's one of the ways to bring everybody into the conversation. And to Peter's, question about at the beginning, why aren't there men in this room? I don't think it should be optional. Okay, I think this is my editorial comment. I don't think any of this should be optional. I think if you're a student at Hong Kong University, you have to go through training on these issues. Period. End of sentence. If you don't want to be a student at Hong Kong University, okay, then you don't go through these trainings. If you want to be on the staff, I'm saying this because I can say this, because I'm American and I'm going home in a couple days. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm serious. I can say this. I'm going to say it. You can do so much if there was leadership and follow through. There's so much that could be accomplished in terms of creating a climate where, number one, the abuse doesn't happen in the first place. Number two, when it does happen, will be supported rather than denied or pretended it didn't happen or blaming them for calling it on themselves. All that stuff can be shifted, and we can be better serving young people who are being educated to become productive and influential members of Hong Kong society and the global village, right? There's so much we can do, but it does start with leadership because it does require resources, it requires time, it requires prioritization. And let me just tell you, in my experience, when institutions don't want to do something, and I work with this all the time, believe me, in the sports culture in the United States, in college campuses until very recently, when institutions don't want to do something, they typically say two things. One is, we don't have time, and we have schedules that are so busy that it's like, it's really important, but we just don't have the time. And everybody else is competing for time too, right? And two, they say we don't have the money. And then what happens is, if it becomes a priority set by the leadership, they miraculously find the time and the money. So it's not about the lack of time or money as much as it is the issue of priorities. Do you really want to do this? Do you really want to be on board? And I'm talking about my program. I'm talking about doing system-wide prevention trainings on university campuses, in high schools, in sports, youth sports. There's so much that could be done in these areas. And if the priority is there, if the leadership is there, by the way, the partnership between women and men, as I said at the beginning, women's leadership has made it all possible, and I've been focusing on the men's piece of it. In MVP, we also have women as bystanders, as friends and teammates, what they can do to speak up and challenge. But the missing piece hasn't been women's leadership. The missing piece has been men's leadership. And so part of what has to happen is we need more men to partner with the women who are already doing so much of the great work, but men to work in support and in dialogue with those women. And then we have, incredible potential. But absent that leadership at senior levels, both of the administration and the faculty, it's a hard row, and you have, how many more decades are we going to have with, rooms, whenever gender is on the agenda, the room is filled with 80% women and a handful of good, supportive men, and nothing changes until we get some more accountability and some more robust leadership. So, I've said a whole lot. Questions, comments, concerns, anything I've said or not said, and is there anything you want to see said in this environment? Because there's an opportunity to say some things if you want to say them. So, anybody want to jump in? Social experiments, like. I've heard it, but I appreciate that it's creative, but the term that I would use is I think we need to build this stuff organically into the educational process and not have it be like an add-on or a special event or a special lecture. It has to be built organically into the educational process. And I don't know what the mechanisms are at Hong Kong University for that. I know in the States what they are, but that's a process of institutionalization, right? In other words, it's not a special add-on. I always emphasize this. It's not a special program. It's built into the training. Like, for example, I think all first-year students at Hong Kong University should go through gender violence prevention training, period, end of sentence. Every single person. It should be mandatory. It should be, you have to, once you've enrolled and you're beginning your first semester, it's just part of your training as a student at Hong Kong University. I mean, that's the kind of thing. I mean, it's easier said than done. I'm just saying that's the kind of thing that I would say. It's going to be built in organically in that way. I mean, I think this needs to be in training for teachers and educational administrators. You have a school of education here, Hong Kong University? I mean, school of education, it should be mandatory for anybody who's going to be a teacher, who's going to be a principal of a high school, an assistant principal. They should have training in all of this. It should be part of their educational expectation, an elective course or something, or professional training they take on the side. It should be, if you're going to be in the 21st century, a principal of high school, you're going to take these training. This is going to be part of your training. By the way, we know in the States, for example, I don't know Hong Kong stats in this case, over 50% of rape victims are raped by the age of 18, 29% of rape victims are raped by the age of 11. We know this. We have data on all of this. Relationship abuse, 1 in 5 girls in high school in the United States are victims of physical or sexual violence from their boyfriends or male partners, 1 in 5. That's millions and millions. That means high school principals are already presiding over a peer culture or over a school culture where there's all kinds of kids who are already experiencing sexual abuse and violence and harassment and relationship abuse. We don't need new data. What we need is leadership. And what we need is education, schools integrate this stuff organically. I got my Ph.D. at UCLA, right? Grad School of Education and Information Studies. You can get a Ph.D. at UCLA, one of the elite schools in the United States, in education without having taken one course in any of this. Now, I'm not saying that you don't get pieces of this or that in this or that course, but you could go through the whole thing and get a Ph.D. and be trained to be a teacher of teachers, right? Without any background formally expected in understanding gender violence and its relationship to educational outcomes. It's pathetic. That's an institutional failure. It's not about individual kids at a party not wanting to intervene. That's about a system not wanting to intervene or do the right thing. So these are the kind of systemic sensibilities we have to bring to this. So it's both the micro in a peer culture, getting people to speak up and challenge, but it's also people who have control of systems, making those systems responsive and proactive rather than passive or reactive. Any other comments or concerns? Yes.
You talked a lot about women's leadership and men's leadership, and I know that you work with young men and young athletes. Do you find that your message and the message that you try to give about this issue being a men's issue, do you find that it's easier for men to hear coming from other men? And how do we teach young men and young women to hear women's authority? Because women do have authority, I just think as a society we haven't quite tuned into it. So how do you think young men respond to women's leadership?
That's a really good question. It's a process. I think that different people are at different stages of their readiness to hear and be challenged. I think that the identity of the person, pedagogically, the identity of the person presenting ideas makes a difference. I think this has been understudied, but I think I'm going to be writing about this myself, but I think it's an incredibly important area. Because, for example, sometimes the young women on campus will say, I can do this. We don't need a guy to do this. I can do this. It's like, so think about this, okay? I started work with the United States Marine Corps in 1997. Okay, the Marine Corps, if you don't know, is the most hyper-masculine service of the United States military, which itself is pretty hyper-masculine. But the Marine Corps is over the top. You familiar with the Marine Corps? I mean, by sort of legend, it's just hyper-masculine. It's also the most male of the services, 94% men in the Marine Corps. So if you have a room full of 100 Marines, you have 94 men. Okay, so imagine this. When I started there, my program was the first program system-wide, but the status quo at the time was each Marine Corps installation or base had a prevention on domestic violence, they didn't even talk about sexual assault back then. They had a domestic violence prevention specialist, and it was typically a civilian woman in her 30s or 40s. Okay, so imagine this. There's a room full of Marines sitting there in uniform and with their short haircuts sitting there, and in through the door walks a civilian woman, typically a white woman, but not always, and she's the domestic violence prevention specialist. Now, no matter how talented that woman is, she has two huge marks against her. One is that she's a woman, and so they're thinking she doesn't understand me, she doesn't understand my life, she doesn't understand the pressures on me, she might be a good person, but she doesn't know jack squat. And number two, she's a civilian, which means that she doesn't know what it's like to be a Marine, and therefore, I'm checking out. That's the status quo. And no matter how talented she is, she has way too much going against her for her to be effective. And my thinking was, we need to get people who are, my goal in those cases was to have a civilian and military training team, or former military, who has credibility. Because we were all former athletes, and we had a lot of credibility because of being athletes. We weren't Marines. I'm not a military member or veteran, I'm sorry, and most of the people we work with aren't veterans, some of them are. We needed some hook of credibility, and being most of us, university athletes, I wasn't, although I was a high school athlete, but you know what I'm saying? We had the hook of credibility to get in through the door with those guys, and that makes a difference. Because it's not just the imparting of information. This isn't about, I can do a PowerPoint presentation as well as any man. That's not what it is. It's about honestly talking about what's going on in male culture, what's going on in women's culture. For example, I don't, and my colleagues who are men don't lead the conversations with women because it's a different conversation. And it's just a different conversation. And so I think we have to be careful that we're not reproducing chivalry, we're not reproducing, men have the solution in a way that's sexist and patriarchal and problematic. And I appreciate, we talk about all this in the pedagogy. We say, what's the difference between a man challenging and interrupting another man's sex? What's the difference between that and a chivalrous attitude like, we're going to protect our women, and therefore you're hurting our women, and we're going to hurt you because you're hurting our women? What's the difference? And there's a subtle and not so subtle difference. As a pedagogical point, I think what we've done is we've talked about, we built in the very discussion. We don't have the answer to the question, but we build in the discussion piece.
One last question, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Thank you. And I appreciate people have hung out. I've gone way over. How about we get these two, and then we'll... Thank you.
You have to press the red button. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. I actually did a little bit of work on cultural reform in the Australian Defence Force, looking at treatment of women, so I was really interested to hear your perspective on that. But when I was doing a bit of work on that, I saw that women in a male-dominated environment like the military, they're often the toughest critic of other women in that environment. So it's that coping mechanism, in a way, telling other women that they should just toughen up, get over it, or it's just how it works in the system. How do you suggest going about challenging this on campus and beyond? And can you see men starting to have that conversation with women in that situation?
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be quick because of people's time and everything, but it's there's so much to your question. I would say in the military, this is an example that you might, take it for what it's worth in the military context, but there might be analogs that you could plug in. In the military, when you have a mixed gender room, the women, I'm telling you my and my colleagues' experience from 20 years of this work, it's very rare to hear a woman in a mixed gender room honestly talk about sexism and what she's experienced in front of men. Because in the military, they want to make it in a very male-dominated space, and they don't want any hint of vulnerability, especially women who are trying to work their way up the chain, in other words, be promoted into positions of leadership, and acknowledging that they have been sexually harassed, they've been victims of violence and abuse, undermines their public presentation of the kind of authority that they need in a male-dominated space. So a lot of these women won't say anything, and sometimes they'll actually criticize other women in those spaces as a way to prove to the men that they're not bashing men, etc. When you get those same women out of the mixed gender space and into a women's conversation, which my female colleagues would be leading, not me, those same women who are sometimes criticizing other women in front of the men will just start talking about all their experiences of harassment and abuse. It's just amazing how that works. So I think there is a discrete, that's one of the reasons why I think there's a discrete space for all women conversations and all men conversations. But I think one of the goals of, and I'm using the binary, people have to identify, we don't have a broad menu of choices. We have, if you identify as a man or a woman, you go where you identify, but we don't have the resources to have all kinds of different, spaces. But the point here is that if you have good conversations in the single gender space, it's a consciousness. You're developing a certain consciousness, and my thought is that men who have gone through those conversations are much more likely to have a better and more constructive conversation with women about these very questions than if they were thrown into initial conversation with women in the room. And I'll give you one example of how this works. If a guy in a room, in a mixed gender room, right, men and women, if a guy makes a statement that's victim blaming, which is not that uncommon, a guy making a victim blaming statement, whether he's well-intended or not, a lot of guys will say something, well, what did you expect? She was hanging all over this guy at the party, that kind of thing. If a guy says something like that, and then a woman in the room says, I hate when guys say that. That's like, she has the right to wear anything she wants. She has the right to do anything she wants. He does not have the right to rape her, that kind of thing. The guy will then typically defend himself, and then other guys around the guy will get the message, you know what? I'm not going to say anything, because if I say anything, because I even agree with my boy over here, but if I say something, I'm going to get criticized. And I'm not blaming the women for this. I mean, it's loaded subject matter. But if it's an all-male space and a guy makes a victim-blaming statement, then us as the facilitators or other men in the room can say something to him like, you might want to think about what you just said there, dude, because I mean, what you're doing here is shifting accountability off of the guy who should, as opposed to, you're an asshole, sexist, And I'm exaggerating for effect, but the point is there's a process that guys need to go through. We can't expect everybody to be at the same level of consciousness in the first conversation. They've had decades of socialization in a sexist culture, and they're going to have pushback, they're going to have defensiveness, they're going to be in denial, shift blame. All that stuff is a part of a process. And so I'm just thinking as an educator, how do you work with that in a way that that acknowledges that they have a long way to go, but it doesn't shut them down in the process. But thank you for your question. And last question, and I appreciate your waiting.
I believe there's often a power dimension in this relationship. So how if in a highly hierarchical structure with a male bully right on the top, bullying other males. So what is your recommendation for the bystanders as well as the targets? What they could do to cope with this powerful bully?
Okay, thank you. I'll try to answer your question and wrap it up in the same sentence or in the same response. I appreciate everybody's patience. Everybody has a long day and it's not over yet. Oh my goodness. I mean, we can't solve every problem. I think, but we're defining in this approach, we're defining people, men and women, who misuse their power and authority, not as strong people who are worthy of our respect, but as people who have problems, who need to be called out and challenged and interrupted. And so this kind of approach opens up space for challenging, thinking about the person who's the bully as being a person who's illegitimately using their power and authority, and should not be, we should not emulate that person. I mean, one of the things that people will say in some critique of some of my work, I think it's deeply problematic critique, but they'll say, like in the United States, this comes from the political right, mostly. Let's not mince words here. I mean, have you been following American politics recently? Yes. My book coming out next month, Man Enough, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity. Anyways, it's all about gender. The whole thing is about gender. The whole thing. The American presidency. My argument is it's always been about gender, by the way. But the gender is invisible because it's always been about manhood. And men are the dominant gender, so it's been invisible. Until a woman runs, then it becomes visible. Just like it's always been about race, but until 2008 when Barack Obama ran, it was always between 2 white guys or 3 white guys, and so no one talked about race. But then a person of color runs, all of a sudden race becomes visible. That's my argument about gender. It's always been about manhood. It's always been contests of meaning about American manhood and 2 different versions of it, but it was never visible in that same way because there was not a woman running. Anyways, by calling attention to these, the right, the political right will say about some of this work, they'll say, we're trying to wimpify men, make men into wimps, make men into soft, not strong. And my argument is that's a misread of this argument. I'm not saying we need to be soft and wimpy. I'm saying we need to redefine what it means to be strong. Because I want to be strong. I have a 14-year-old son. My wife, of course, and I want him to be strong. The question is, how do you define strength? Is strength defined as power over somebody? You can impose your will? Is that how narrow a definition of strength we want to hang our hat on? Or is strength moral courage and ethical decision-making and responsible, citizenship and all that? And it takes more courage, as I said earlier. It takes more courage as a guy, for example, to challenge other guys' sexism than it does to go along with it. It takes nothing special to go along with it. It takes great strength to challenge and interrupt it. You're redefining what strength means in a positive way and bullies of any kind in that metric are not strong. They might have they might have big fists or able to physically impose their will, but they're limited human beings in many other respects. And let's say that out loud and not just accept that because you're tough and you have physical ability, that somehow that makes you a strong person. That's bull. And we say this stuff right out loud. It's like, let's not mince words. Let's just say it right out loud. And I think a lot of men feel the pressure releasing when you have these kind of conversations, because so many men are policed into conformity with some of these norms, including lots of young men in Hong Kong who are going along with lots of behavior that they know is wrong, but they don't have the strength to challenge it and to interrupt it. But those of us who are educators and parents and others in positions of influence, we're in a position to open up this kind of dialogue. We can't expect the young kids to open up this conversation. That's our responsibility. And I hope that some of the ideas I've given you today give you some pathways to taking some of these ideas and adapting them in whatever way you think is productive. Thank you very much.
Jackson, just let me say on behalf of the university, the Women's Foundation, the Centre for Comparative,
Public law.
That was absolutely terrific. Thank you very much. You talk so much common sense. I really appreciate your message. I hope everybody that heard it goes off and transmits it, and we have a whole load more bystanders as a result of your coming here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all for your patience and indulgence, but I just will ask for one additional minute. If I can ask Jess to please go to the last slide. I think it's really important before we sign off for tonight, if I ask you all to join us in making a commitment tonight and say this out loud together so that it stays with us, if you don't mind. So this is the pledge. So I'm going to start and you can all just sort of read off the screen. I am one of billions who believe that everyone is born free and equal. I will take action against gender bias, discrimination, and violence to bring the benefits of equality to us all. Thank you, everyone, for staying back.
Really terrific. Thank you very much. That's great. Thanks for yourself. No, it was good. We started a bit late anyway, so you didn't really know that. We were a bit late starting.